Hi everyone, welcome back. You guys enjoyed the Abyss guide last month, so I'm back with another one. If you're new here, we'll be breaking down all enemy data as well as useful strategies and optimal teams. Fortunately, we have a much less restrictive Abyss this month, so hopefully by the end you guys can get your own 36-star clear. Anyways, before we get into it, if this video helps you, be sure to leave a like, let me know in the comments, and subscribe to the channel if you are not already for more content like this. Also, if you think I missed anything important, let me know in the comment section, and I'll make a pinned comment with any relevant info. But without further ado, let's hop right into the Abyssal Moon Blessing and Leyline Disorders. This month's Abyssal Moon Blessing generates a shockwave whenever your active character receives healing. This is a pretty straightforward buff, but like usual, it isn't really something to actively try to build your team around. It's a nice little thing to have should you be running a healer, but nothing else beyond that. As for our Leyline Disorders, the first half has 600% swirl damage bonus. As we will see shortly, the first half is very AoE heavy, so this will naturally synergize with many of the picks that are good in these chambers. Obviously, Mizuki with her being on banner, but more importantly to me, for the first time since 2021, Venti is viable on Abyss 12. And not just viable, I'd say he's easily one of the best picks here. Of course, also Kazuha, Sucrose, Driver Lanyan, and Driver Hazel are great with this. These are the ones that will benefit the most from this, but 600% is such a huge amount that even a regular Animo DPS like Xiao or Wanderer will get a solid boost. Now onto the second half, we get a 75% cryo charge attack damage bonus. Realistically, the only ones that will be seeing any benefit from this are Ganyu and Wriothesley. You could argue Ayaka, but Freeze is not great versus the enemies on this side, so you'd have to play Melt, and Melt Ayaka is kinda niche. So for the purpose of this video, we will just say Ganyu and Wriothesley. Starting things off with Chamber 1 first half, we have 3 waves of 3 Eremites totaling 9 enemies, each with between 600 and 700,000 HP. Each wave has 1 enemy with 50% Hydro Res, 1 enemy with 50% Cryo Res, and 1 enemy with 50% Electro Res. Honestly, these resists should not prove problematic, but if you're struggling while running any of these as your primary damage source, maybe consider swapping. In particular, if you're running Electro, as the ones with the Electro Res are also the ones with the highest HP of the 3. But these are pretty simple enemies, so their resists are negligible for the most part. Because there are quite a few enemies at once, you'll want to focus on AoE in this chamber. Playing AoE teams with Animo to utilize the swirl buffs is generally going to be the best choice, but you could also run a Dendro team with good AoE like Nilo or Burgeon. There's honestly not much special about this chamber or how you approach it. The best way to increase your clear speeds here is through good grouping of the enemies to keep consistent uptime on your AoE damage. If you're playing a grouper, effective placement of grouping skills is your key for this. The second wave spawns on the opposite side of the arena from the first and third waves, so pulling enemies towards the middle of the stage means you can more effectively transfer your DPS to new waves as they spawn. For Venti and Sucrose, this means walking behind the first wave before throwing your ult out, and for Kazuha, this means using your skill as close to the center as you can. For Mizuki, this doesn't really apply, as she's very mobile while she's doing damage, so you can pretty easily just fly over to each new wave as it spawns. If you're not playing an Animo grouper, you can still group enemies by using their AI against them. You do this by staying as close to the enemies as you can at all times. The Hydro and Electro Eremites have a dash attack, and if they use it they will almost certainly spread themselves away from the group. However, they will never use this attack if you're close to them. All of their other attacks are stationary or just slightly move them, so as long as you remain close to the enemies, they should keep themselves grouped for you. Finally, something that you might want to consider to save yourself a few seconds, if you are not running a grouper, is to not chase after the second wave. When they spawn, stand where the first and third waves spawn, and let them come to you. This way, when the third wave spawns, you will be standing on top of them, and can instantly transfer your DPS onto them. This is mostly a desperation play though, as it will only save a few seconds at best, and you're at the mercy of RNG when you let the enemies come to you. Because they can and will ungroup themselves depending on which attack they choose to use when you're far from them. Moving on to Chamber 1 second half, we have 5 waves of Ruin Guards and Ruin Graders. The guards have 730,000 HP, and the graders have 940,000 HP, and they spawn in the order Guard, Grader, Guard, Grader, Guard. Honestly, this is the simplest Abyss chamber we've had in a very long time. The mechanic, if you can even call it that, is that the enemies spawn in a lot of waves. Literally, all you have to do is bring your best single target DPS team. The only thing I can really think of is that you should avoid characters that need to apply a debuff to an enemy to be effective. Think stuff like Nahida or Lanyan. Instead, you want buffers like Bennett or Farina, or off-field application like Xingqiu or Zhengling. To be honest, pure debuffers are quite rare nowadays, so I doubt this is an issue you would run into anyways. I'd love to give more advice, but the best team here is going to vary heavily from account to account, so just slap your best single target team and you should be perfectly fine. Unless it's physical. Don't play physical against Ruin enemies. Next up, we have Chamber 2 first half, where we have a ton of hilly churls. It honestly feels a lot like Abyss from years ago. The spawn criteria here is a bit different than normal. Firstly, there are 12 regular hilly churls. They will continuously spawn so that there are always 2 alive at a time until all 12 are dead. Independently from the regular hilly churls, we have 6 Mighty Churls and 4 rogues that come in 5 waves. The spawn order is 2 Mighty Churls, 2 Mighty Churls, 2 rogues, 2 Mighty Churls, 2 rogues. Similar to the previous chamber, AoE is very important here. Once again, AoE teams with an Animo to utilize the swirl buffs will be best, and AoE heavy Dendro teams like Nilo are also good. The most crucial component of this chamber is target prioritization. Because the Mitochurls and Rogues spawn in waves, you must prioritize killing them first. Even if you kill all 12 Helichurls, if you haven't focused the Mitochurls, you will still have 5 waves of enemies left. If you have any semblance of AoE in your party, the regular Helichurls will die without you even having to think about them, so the Mitochurls and Rogues should be your top priority. The Mitochurls are much easier to deal with than the Rogues, given that they only have 350,000 HP versus the 960,000 of the Rogues, and they will charge at you, making them naturally easier to kill with AoE. The Rogues, however, will stand exactly where they spawn and literally never move if you don't come to them. From the very start of the fight, you should make your way towards the right side of the arena, as this is where the first wave of Rogues spawn. The 2 waves of Mitochurls that come in before the Rogues will run at you anyways, so forcing them to come to where you want to be for the Rogues will make it easier to transfer your DPS to the Rogues as soon as they spawn. Once the first Rogue wave is dealt with, you can actively chase down the third Mitochurl wave. This Mitochurl wave spawns in the exact same spot as the second Rogue wave, so you should try not to let them move too far from their spawn. That's pretty much it for this chamber though. Focus down the Mitochurls and Rogues, let the Helichurls kill themselves on your AoE, and hopefully that can get you through this one quickly. Now we have Chamber 2 second half, where we have an experimental field generator with 3 million HP. This guy's been in Abyss quite a few times, so most of you are likely familiar with him already, but let's break down the fight regardless. He has 70% Geo resist, so avoid using Geo here if possible. As soon as the fight starts, the boss will start the low gravity mechanic. It will reduce the gravity of the whole arena, increasing your jump height, and gain a new set of attacks. The main attack to be worried about in this phase is the Shockwave. This attack is unable to be dodged with a dash, so you must block it, jump over it, or else get hit by it. There are 3 main ways to deal with this mechanic. You can utilize the gravity for jumps and plunges, you can bring a strong shield to ignore it, or you can cancel the boss out of this mechanic. For the first option, you'll want to bring a character with good plunge multipliers, plus bringing Shan Yun for the Animo hits on plunge helps if you have her. Claymore characters and Shao will be the best option for your plunger. Diluc, who has the highest plunge multiplier in the game, will dominate here. So if you have a decent plunge Diluc build, consider bringing him out here. I also want to note that even though this boss has 70% Geo res, Navia actually performs quite well in this setting. Being a Claymore lets her utilize the good plunge multiplier well, and her shotgun shots are very quick, so you have to spend very little time on the ground to be getting her full damage. You definitely need quite a good Navia build, plus probably Farina in the party to offset the 70% Geo res. However, the flow of her kit works very well against these mechanics, so maybe consider giving her a try. Now moving on to the next method of dealing with this mechanic, shielding. You need to bring a strong shielder because these waves do a large amount of damage. A decently built Zhongli can eat about 3 of the waves usually. This gives you a decent window to be able to pump your DPS uninterrupted, great for someone like Melt Ganyu who can also utilize a 75% cryo charge tag bonus. But yeah, this method is pretty self-explanatory, just shield it. The final method of cancelling the boss out of the mechanic allows you to completely not deal with this altogether. The way to do it is simply to hit the boss with 3 Numa aligned attacks. Here's the list of options for this, and a quick note, Farina must be in healer stance for this part. This is probably the least efficient method of dealing with this, as the character options are simply too limited, and in some cases, forcing Numa into your party will cost you more damage than you would gain by cancelling the mechanic. On top of this, the cooldown for the dealing Numa damage on most of these characters is a bit too high to be able to consistently cancel the mechanic. Overall, I would personally recommend to bring either a strong shield, particularly Melt Ganyu with Zhongli if you have it, or a plunge focus team here if you want to optimally clear. Next up, we have Chamber 3 first half, which is quite similar to Chamber 1 second half in that it is incredibly simple. This chamber has 2 waves of 2 Ruined Drake Earth Guards with 1.5 million HP each. Most likely you have an AoE team here due to how AoE heavy the first 2 chambers were, and while AoE is not bad here, you certainly do not need as much AoE as you did previously, and you could definitely stand to lose some of that AoE for higher single target output. Swapping to pure single target like Hu Tao or light AoE like Navia will be a much comfier clear than using something like Venti team versus just 2 enemies at a time. Regardless, the swirl buff does still exist and you can make AoE work here just fine. If you swap to a single target team, there isn't much to say about this chamber, just kill the enemies and move on. I guess you can try to clip both enemies at a time with some of your hits, in order to save a few seconds clear time should you need it. If you kept AoE though, the main thing to maintain solid damage output is to keep the enemies grouped. In neutral, these enemies will walk away from you, so even if it is tempting to stand in between the 2 enemies to get good AoE damage, doing this means they will both walk in opposite directions and ungroup themselves. In the long run, you're better off standing to the side of one enemy or constantly circling around both of them, that way they will both back up in the same direction and you can still clip them with your AoE just fine. Contrary to the previous half, we actually have some mechanics on Chamber 3 second half. This chamber has the Solitary Suwani with 3.5 million HP. I already covered this guy in last month's Abyss video, so I'll keep this part a bit brief. If you want a more detailed breakdown of his mechanics, check out last month's video. Firstly, this boss has 70% Animo res, so avoid using an Animo DPS here. The boss has 3 mechanics, freeze, lunge, and swirl. Freeze is when he starts charging up an attack, gains resist, and self-hydro applies. To deal with this, you must freeze him, and then dispel freeze with a Geo, Pyro, Electro, Animo, or Blunt attack. Successfully doing this stuns the boss. The lunge is the exact same thing, except it's much faster, and instead of charging an attack, he just lunges forward. The main difference is that it's very easy to miss. Finally, Swirl is when he starts charging an attack, gains resists, and spawns 3 animo balls around him. These balls must be swirled. Successfully doing this will stun the boss. The 2 freeze mechanics are skippable, but the animo one is not. If you opt to do this, you need a pretty high damage team, as you have to wait out the charge every time it does the freeze mechanic. And that's pretty much it for the mechanics. The main difference this month is that it's on the side with 75% cryo charge attack bonus, while last month it was on the side with 75% pyro normal attack bonus. Meaning that last month you were encouraged to play a pyro DPS with a cryo support, but now you're encouraged to play a cryo DPS instead. Ganyu and Wriothesley once again are going to be the best here, Wriothesley especially as he can literally solo every single mechanic, though Ganyu Melt will also break through every mechanic with ease. If you don't have either of these options though, you can just play your normal strongest single target option. Simply analyze your team and see where you can slot in a cryo. For example, stuff like replacing Zhongli with Layla, or using Furina Charlotte instead of Furina Jean. In theory, it would be a DPS loss to use these characters, but when you account for the amount of stuns you get by using a cryo character, it is absolutely worth it. After you get a cryo character in your party, just ensure that you have a way to dispel the freeze and you're good to go. Almost every solid team has at least one of a blunt, geo, pyro, animo, or electro attack though, so this probably doesn't even need to be considered most of the time. As I said last month, the best way to deal with this fight is to play reactionary. Deal with the mechanics as the boss uses them, and you can keep the boss stunned for the majority of the fight while you just wail on it. Overall, this Abyss is much friendlier than last month, and you're much more flexible with your options. As I always say, the best approach if you're struggling is to take things one chamber at a time, and build teams specifically for that chamber, and reset and build teams for the next chamber after you're done with the first one. If you don't like team swapping however, let's talk about some of the best options for you. I said it 100 times throughout this video, but in the first half, you want to use an animo grouper. Teams with Venti, Kazuha, Mizuki, and Sugros will be great here. If you don't have a good team with them, Dendro teams will also be sufficient. In fact, I think Nilo Bloom is on par with the Anemo teams in the first half due to the sheer amount of AoE. Other Dendro options are fine too, like Burgeon, but Nilo is definitely the best of the Dendro options. Finally, Wanderer is also quite good here despite not having any grouping. He naturally has solid AoE, and even with no EM, the swirl buff does benefit him somewhat. As for the second half, you have near unlimited choices. Melt, Ganyu, and Wriothesley will be the best choices generally, as they can utilize the Leyline disorder and both of their standard teams have ways to deal with the boss mechanics with ease. But realistically, you should be fine simply putting your best single target team here. Both bosses have ignorable mechanics, and you can just brute force them down with enough single target damage. However, if this proves to not be enough for you, you can focus on bringing solid plungers or a good shield, as well as a cryo character. Anyways, that's pretty much all there is to say about this Abyss. Once again, if you have any questions or need any specialized advice for your account, drop a comment below. If this was helpful to you, don't forget to leave a like and let me know in the comments, that way I can keep doing this in the future. And of course, subscribe for more Genshin Impact content. But that's going to be all from me today. Hopefully you all have a good one, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye bye.